So my talk is, what is the value of social capital? I'm really excited to talk right after Edgar, even though it's a bit intimidating. A lot of this talk revolves around some of the ideas of complexity and the implications of it, and how we can use social capital to address some of those implications. So I'd like to start with a really simple exercise. I'd like you guys to spend a minute answering this question. If you have a pen and you could write it down, it will be useful. Could you just spend 1 minute writing down what properties would your ideal software architecture have? So often this is expressed as things like flexibility or security or modularity. What's 5 words that you would use to describe your ideal software architecture? If you write it down, then you'll remember what you were thinking right now, which is a good idea. People out there still writing. It's good. What are the five properties you might want in your software architecture? So like your software architect, your chief architect might come to you and say, these are the properties that we want in our software architecture. Okay, looks like most people are done. So my talk is, we're going to explore just really briefly what the definition of social capital is. It seems reasonable since to talk about social capital. And then what are the problems that we're trying to address with social capital? And how theoretically might we use social capital to solve for those problems? And then finally, what are some really specific practices and practical applications that you guys can take back with you and see if they work inside your own organizations? So what is social capital? The short answer is social capital is an organization's ability to distribute and leverage trust. This trust is a very specific kind of trust, often better described as reciprocity. So the way I find most people understand reciprocity most easily is when we go to the bar later, I'll buy you a beer. And we won't really negotiate. We're not going to keep a tab, right? We're not going to keep a tab like I spent $5 and then you spent $5 and we'll just say like I'll buy a beer this time and I expect that either you or someone like you will buy me a beer later. It's reciprocity, and the real interesting quality of reciprocity ends up being that you defer a lot of disagreement and a lot of negotiation about the value of a specific interaction. You just defer it. You say, well, we don't have to have that right now. And trust and reciprocity will allow you to defer that interaction and defer that conversation for a later date. So we can kind of explore where social capital came from. And it's interesting. So what capital originally back here meant the ability to purchase and own machines and buildings, right? So like capital meant the ability to physically own something, the means of production. So you often had to hire human beings to maintain the means of production, but really the value in the original capital concept was the owning of the mechanisms that you would use to create value. So we move forward from here to human capital, and in human capital what ends up happening is people start figuring out, well, if I actually have people who are talented at either making new types of machines or maintaining particular types of machines, they're valuable, and I don't want them to leave my organization. So in human capital, the idea, what we're managing, what we're trying to own is literally the knowledge, the people themselves. We want to keep the people in our organizations. So human capital is the birth of HR. And in a lot of ways, human capital starts having managers think things like, how do I develop individual people? How do I create individuals that are better or more talented? And then we move forward, and one of the tricky things about human capital is it's really hard to own people in modern societies, so it doesn't work very well. So then we have this idea of intellectual capital. And intellectual capital is the birth of knowledge management, the birth of IT. And basically it's this idea that, hey, wait a second, if we could extract all the information from people's heads and have them write it down somewhere, and maybe put it on a disk drive and be able to search for it, then we wouldn't need the people necessarily to be around. We just have other people read the instructions and do that. So the birth of knowledge management and the management and ownership of ideas as opposed to people becomes intellectual capital. And then finally we get to social capital, which is what I would suggest that most businesses are trying to address right now. So the difference between intellectual capital and social capital is that when we look at social capital, the value, what we're trying to manage is the network of interactions of people in the organization. No individual one person has value. And when we look at some of the implications of knowledge work in a minute, you'll see that it's very difficult to actually extract knowledge from people's heads. So what we want to do is we want to manage for social interactions and increase trust so that what we're managing over here is a network. And it's not knowledge, and it's not people, and it's not things. So Ronald Burt, who I'll reference quite a bit, kind of points out this more clearly, I think. And he says, the human capital explanation of inequality, so the way that human capital explains why some people are better at things than other people is that they're better individuals. They have some sort of genetic betterness, or they have learned something or been trained to do something that makes them individually more valuable. And social capital explains this in a completely different way. And it says that, in fact, the reason why those people do better than other people is because they're better connected to the networks that they do work in. So the classic study around this is they took some lawyers. You take a high-performing lawyer out of one law firm, and you put him into another law firm, and his performance will plummet. And the reason for the performance degradation is because he doesn't know who to go to get the information that he needs. He doesn't know how to work the network yet. And obviously, he'll recover that performance, but it's not the individual that has the skill, it's the individual's relationships that allow him to be skillful. So Putnam, again, points out this idea that social capital is the amount of trust or reciprocity in a community or between individuals. So when we think about social capital, it's the same as any other form of capital. The more of it we have in our organizations, the more fluid we have, the more fluid our economy of trust is. So more money means we can invest in more things. More social capital means that we can do more things as a community together with the trust that we have. And finally, Don Cohn and Prusek here define it this way. And one of the things they've defined that I think is the most important is the active connection and the trust that all the other ones point out. But they also point out this, which is the key quality of social capital in businesses is that it makes action possible. It's the thing that allows you to act without that extreme negotiation that we see in so many businesses. So let's look at why this might be important. Does everybody kind of generally know what I mean by knowledge work? Knowledge work would be not making things that you can touch at the end of the day, stuff in your head. Software is a good example of knowledge work, but any sort of art or music, all knowledge work, things that you do with your head. And I like to explain this with some pictures. And so I'm going to show you a slide, and I'd like you to silently say what you see on the slide in your head. So silently means don't say it out loud, right? So in your head, say what you see. Does anybody need to see that again? Everybody get that? OK. So can you raise your hand if you saw this? So I'd say that's a large majority of the audience, interestingly. So clap. You guys are all right. Very good. How many of you saw this? So I'd say maybe a quarter of the audience, maybe a third. So this is from a study that Kahneman did called The Effects of Context on Accessibility. And one of the interesting things about knowledge work is the way that context informs and cannot be disentangled from our understanding of things. This is only a two-dimensional contextual problem, right? There's only two dimensions to it. It's either it's either your alpha or your numeric, right? But in a lot of the problems that we address daily as knowledge workers, we're talking massively multi-dimensional contexts, right? So one of the problems when we're trying to address each other as knowledge workers is when we try to exchange information with each other, we're not even sure which context informs our understanding of what we're doing. Never mind how to explain that context to someone else. And so this means that in a lot of ways, knowledge gets locked into specific contexts. It becomes embodied or embedded in specific contextual spaces. So here's another example. I like this one. So everybody kind of sees that this brick color and this brick color are the same. Would you believe me if I told you that was the same color? How many people think that's the same color? 2 or 3. So those are literally the exact same color. You have to trust me. I'm not playing any tricks. They are exactly the same color. And so here's one of the really interesting things about this is that the reason why you see that is because your brain says that this isn't a shadow, so this must be a different color than that. It has to be lighter, because otherwise it would be darker than the top brick. Now, one of the interesting things about this that I think is fascinating is that, oh, sorry, wrong way. You guys see now, you see that it's this way, and you trust me that I'm not playing any tricks. You see that you know in your mind that those are the same color, but you can't see it. Your brain won't allow you to actually see it correctly, right? And so I like to imagine if you were a software engineer. So a software engineer, I know the hexadecimal colors for these two squares. They're exactly the same. And the manager comes in and says, I want you to make these two squares the same color. And the software engineer goes, they are the same color, right? And so this happens all the time, too, where we have these contextual differences, where we can see things and knowledge from different points of view, and we literally can't even experience the same kind of phenomena coming out of the system, which I think is fascinating. And here's a final example. How many people see her going this way? Raise your hand. About half, maybe a little less. How many people see her going this way? Some of you aren't raising your hands, so you're cheating. So how about this? Are people out there capable of see her going either way? Can you make her flip back and forth? OK, cool. There's about 3 people who can do that. So this is a bistable image. And that means that some people will see it going one direction, and some people will see it going the other direction. The interesting thing is that about 30% of you will not be able to make her go the other way, no matter how long you look at it. So you can imagine, again, the types of conversations that this might engender. We're not leaving this room until we all know that she's rotating to the left. Right? How many times you guys have conversations like that? And the thing about this is that this is at least a visual problem where we can all at least visually be seeing the same thing. Many of the conversations we have about innovation and new ideas are novel and intangible. We can't touch them, we can't see them, they don't exist yet. And we're trying to have conversations like this where people are perceiving completely different things because of their contextual experience, and they're not able to resolve it. So Dave Snowden is a complexity theorist and talks about a concept called Kinevin. And these are some rules that he has, or some heuristics, I would say, that he has extracted about how knowledge is transferable inside of organizations, or the limits on our ability to transfer things, based on kind of what I just showed you, right? And so they're really simple, but really the impacts are quite interesting. So the first one is knowledge can only be volunteered. It can't be conscripted. So I can't force you to tell me things. You'll only tell me what you want to tell me. So the classic is, how many of you have like a wiki? And you tell people they have to update the wiki. And then the wiki doesn't really ever get updated, or the links rot, or the information is not really valuable to other people, right? So you can't force people to update the wiki. Wikipedia is obviously an example of you can get people to volunteer, but you can't force them to do it. We only know what we need to know when we need to know it. So this is that concept of context again. And in this case, often we don't know how to do things unless we're right there and we're in the situation, and then it's just obvious what we should do. But when we're extracted or abstracted from that context, we can't explain it really well. I think the best example of this is most organizations do performance reviews. You pull someone out of their normal workday, you put them in a room and you say, what do you want to do for the next year? And everybody kind of goes, I don't know, stuff. And you've completely removed them from their daily life. You've removed them from the place where they do their work and their teammates. And you've isolated them and asked them to report on what it is they do. And in fact, they don't really know what they do unless they're doing it in the right context. So another thing we can see is that everything is fragmented. So this is easier to explain nowadays. Everybody does Twitter nowadays, and you can see what this means. In order to use our communications channels more effectively, we compress everything. Tweets are an excellent example of this. And we compress it by removing all the contextual references that we already share, right? So if I know you, we can communicate in much shorter messages. But if I showed you my Twitter stream with some of my friends, most of you would have no idea what was happening, right? So because I share a context with a lot of people, I remove that information, and it makes everything fragmented. So when you have new team members come onto Teams and they look and try to understand what's happening, if they don't previously share the context, often it just is meaningless. It's like looking at someone's Twitter stream and not understanding why anything's being said. The way we know things is not the way we report we know things. So almost always people use post hoc rationalizations to explain their behavior. They want to appear rational. They never want to appear irrational. So they will explain things so that they look rational. And the result of that is that pretty frequently, if you ask somebody, how did you make that decision, write it down, or what process did you use to make that, write it down, they will write down a process that had nothing to do with what they did. It will be a complete fabrication. And finally, we always know more than we can say, and we will always say more than we can write down. So as we try to make things more tangible, more closer to paper, stuff that we can this idea that information is something that we can pass around to each other so we can make an object of it and give it to someone else, and that they can consume that object and somehow get the information in their head. The more we try to do that, the less we're capable the less information we're capable of putting into it. So again, as we try to write things, we create more and more fragmented information. So all of these basically say a really simple problem, which is in most organizations, we use two different structures for figuring out how to do things. One is a hierarchical structure in which the idea is somehow you move the information from the leaf nodes to a central decision maker, and that decision maker passes the decisions back down. Of course, if you believe what I just told you, it's very difficult to move the information up to the central decision maker in any sort of useful way. And the other one is consensus building, which is all the leaf nodes had to agree on what they're going to do before moving forward. So all of this is what I call the problem of expertise, and I think most people can understand it in the first way. So this is the way I usually get people to understand it. How many of you have a boss that doesn't know what you do? Bosses always have ties, right? So people kind of, generally you know somebody who's like, my boss is an idiot, he doesn't know what I do, right? It used to be that everything was kind of guild-based, and so you'd have if you wanted to be a goldsmith, you'd go to an apprentice with a goldsmith, and he knew everything about gold, right? But I was a CTO, and I had DBAs and Java experts and C++ experts, and people had spent 20 years studying all these kind of obscure, abstract, small, niche pieces of knowledge, and there was really no way that I knew everything everybody else knew, right? There's so much skill involved, so much experience involved, that to some level, lots of managers are making decisions that they just have no ability to comprehend, right? So 2 DBAs arguing about some obscure reference to a stored procedure. And how is it that this guy is going to actually make that decision if he doesn't have the expertise to do it? And expertise, again, since we saw it previously, is experience. It's based on the fact that you did it. It's not based on the fact that you read it or someone told it to you. You have to do it to own it. So that's interesting, and I think most people can get that idea that somehow there's an information gap between these two, right? There's an asymmetric amount of information. These guys have certain information, and this guy has certain information, and they don't always share the same context and the same information, and that's difficult. What most people don't, I think, realize is that this happens not just up and down hierarchies, but across hierarchies, right? So your dev team and your ops team don't see the same artifacts. They see the same code, and they try to do the same things, but they see them from such radically different perspectives often that they don't agree on how to operate or how to work with those things. So what I see in far too many organizations is what the desire is, again, that all this ambiguity must be removed so that we can act, right? So that's the main thing, is that we have to remove the ambiguity from the decisions, and we're going to do this with one of 2 ways. We're either going to use a central decision maker and funnel all the information up so that he can make a decision, or we're going to make, you're going to use a consensus model. And in the consensus model, we're all going to sit in a room until we all agree that she's turning to the left, right? It doesn't matter in the end whether or not that's true or not, but for whatever reason, many organizations are so concerned with efficiency that they will not act until they determine the single best action to take next. So you're trying to reduce all the ambiguity so that you can actually say this is the best next option, right? If you saw Scott Birkin's talk yesterday, he talked about Magellan, and he said, you know, one of the ways you explore is you have 3 ships, and you send 1 ship down the coast, and 1 ship up the coast, and 1 ship in the river, and the 3 of them come back together and report on what they find. Well, if those 3 ships had to sit offshore and all agree which direction to go first, everyone would just starve to death before they found anything. I think this happens a lot in modern organizations. So the impact of all this all these constraints on knowledge transfer is profound. And one of the things we might say is that information and skill, knowledge are embedded in networks and relationships. They're not owned by individuals. And individuals, in fact, don't own information. They attract, translate, and know how and where to access information in networks as it emerges around them, right? So in this way, really the skill of being a skillful knowledge worker is essentially knowing who knows what you need to know and knowing them well enough and sharing enough context so that you can transfer the information effectively between you and the other person. So there's some implications to this. Most organizations rely a lot on authority, and we need to move away from authority-based mechanisms for making decisions. Decisions made by authority remove very quickly social capital from the system. It basically says, I don't trust you to make the decision yourself, and since I don't trust you, I'm explaining out loud that we have no social capital. And we need to move towards reputation. So good managers, instead of using authority, will use reputation. I'll get to what I mean by reputation in a minute. But managers need to use their skills connecting people together and making co-creating good decisions with people more than using authority to make decisions. The other thing is, because we don't necessarily have authority like we used to, we need to move from assignment, in which I have a catalog of all your skills, and it's job descriptions, basically. And what I do is I have a problem, and I look through my catalog of people, and I find the best match, and I assign them, right? If you don't really understand the work that the people who are working for you do, because they have expertise that you don't share, this doesn't work very well. So instead, we need to move towards models that embrace opportunity. So explaining the problems to people and having them volunteer to solve them, because they know that they feel like they might know the answer, would be a more effective model. So now let's move away from kind of the problems and go towards some theory of how we might fix this. So this is like the classic Rooks problem. Everybody know Rooks Law? Rooks Law basically says the more people there are on your team, the more nodes there are, and the more time you spend communicating as opposed to doing. This is the source of the two-pizza team. So you keep teams under like 10 or 12 people. So this is the traditional way of dealing with kind of these problems of shared context and not being able to move information around well. And I want to introduce you very quickly to Bert's ideas about how you might do this. So the first thing Bert says is that you need to have structural holes in your organization. So all he means by a structural hole is that this is a network, and this is a network, and they don't share any members or connections, right? So there's a hole between them. And so this is really interesting and important because in a lot of organizations, they spend a lot of time making sure everybody understands the same things. But actually, when you overconnect social networks, there's a profound problem that happens. This is what Bert found. Basically, this is on this axis is highly connected networks, so highly homogeneous networks. And on this axis is loosely connected networks, so not disconnected networks, but loosely connected networks. So more heterogeneous. And this is a power law of performance. So basically what this graph predicts is as you overconnect networks, as you increase the number of connections in networks, the performance of the system radically drops. It quickly plummets, right? And so what would that explain? Well, how might you explain that? Well, there's a theory from biology that is called punctuated equilibrium, and this might be one of the reasons why it works like this. So in this first stasis model, all the little snails are all interbreeding, and so you have a very homogeneous species. Everyone shares the same traits. And something changes that isolates a small group of them, and the small group, the isolated population, evolves very rapidly. And it's because they're not interbreeding so much with such a large set, and the result of it is that you have some snails with larger shells. So if you want innovation inside of your organizations, if you want to develop new ideas and new things, then this model of isolating people is important. But we need a balance, right? And so the next idea, really quickly, is called brokering. And so a broker is this network and some guy who stands in the middle of these two networks and knows something about what each side is doing. And there's some really interesting properties to brokers. Brokers have three major benefits. They have access to alternative opinion and practice early. They have early access to new opinions, and they have the ability to move ideas between groups. So brokers are people who basically can see both sides of the snails and select which snails to interbreed across if snails are ideas in your organizations. So brokers are really interesting. They're also really dangerous. So there's good brokers and there's bad brokers. And you need to make sure you have good brokers in your organization. So brokers have an advantage, and the advantage is because they're located in a specific location in the social structure, and they have better access to certain things, which means that they have asymmetric information, and they can leverage it not necessarily to your benefit. This gets us to the final idea that you would use to make social capital work in your organization, and it's called closure. So the way closure works is Bad brokers do this. They say, hey, Joe, you have a problem with the database, the Oracle database, and Bill over here on this other team, you also have a similar problem. You go back to Joe and you say, Joe, tell me when you figure out the answer. And when Joe figures out the answer, you take the information and you give it to Bill. And you've just stolen Joe's social capital, right? So you've stolen credit for solving the problem. Right? Good social brokers, what they'll do is do closure, which means they'll say, hey, Bill and Joe, you guys have similar problems. You should talk to each other and try to figure out what the solution is, and then let us know, right? So the really interesting quality of this is that in a bad brokerage, you don't know where the information is necessarily coming from or going to. In a good one with closure, one of the things that initially happens with Joe and Bill is they talk about Jabe. They talk about whether Jabe's trustworthy and whether or not he's a good bet, right? So is he trustworthy? So the result of that is that the information about the trustworthiness of the broker himself is spread through the network, and it causes the network to trust the broker more. And increase the social capital across the entire network. So the value is in the relationships. All right, so one really quick, I'm running out of time, I got 10 minutes. So one really quick thing, in many organizations what you can see is one team and another team. So this might be your dev team and this might be your ops team. And often they're separated by an invisible infinite queue of work. So infinite queue meaning it's uncontrolled, right? And so when this team has a problem with the ops team, in most organizations, both of these teams have managers, and those managers report to a third tier, right? So this might be the director of operations, and this might be the director of technology, and this might be the CIO. Now, does this network have closure? The answer is no, because the CIO doesn't know enough about these people and what they're doing day to day to actually create closure across this network, right? So in most organizations, you can very quickly go in and find these gaps in the organization and stick brokers in there to solve them. So really quick run through of things that you might do when you get home. First of all, model interactions, model the social interactions. How many of you have something that looks like this in your business? A value stream map? So value stream map says all the processes that you need to use to take something from the front of your business to the back of your business, from ideation to the customer. And each of these steps is the processes that you use. Often, if you go into most organizations, these will be separate teams. And in the traditional way of looking at this, you're looking for the information flows and the material flows. So the way that physical objects move through your organization or the way that information moves through your organization. So I'd like to suggest that one of the things you could do with this is, in fact, actually look at the value stream as a linear view of your social network. What does that mean? If these are each teams, these are all social interactions across teams. So this team and this team, often in the middle, again, invisible queue. The first thing you might do is try to find a broker that can broker those teams very quickly. So just go through your organization, find each team, each downstream. So you have an ordered list of teams. This team feeds work to this team, that feeds work to this team. Create a broker. Make sure that you monitor that broker and make sure they have closure of their network and that they're not cheating or being bad brokers so that you increase the social capital. By making embodied experiences, skills, and knowledge available on demand, structures capable of dynamic teaming gain significantly higher resiliency. So what does that mean? This is another technique that you might use or an idea you might explore. I call it Pareto team stability. So in any team, you can assume 80% of the team should stay stable, and you can move up to 20% of the team about every 3 months, if possible. There's some tricks to this. Often, the people who like to move will self-identify, and the people who like to stay on static teams will self-identify. The real trick here is people tend to think that the idea is that this guy is going to take information from this team and bring it to this team, but it's actually more like an antibody reaction. This guy will go to this team and literally say, why do you guys do it like that? And the team will have to explain their behavior every 3 months to another person. This is why we do it this way, which will allow them to take their tacit knowledge and make it explicit every couple months. And so if you just move people around, especially people who ask good questions move around, it's a very powerful technique for doing that. Amy Edmondson has a book called Teaming, which is excellent. And she basically says this, which is, in most organizations, we consider teams to be static things, like a football team. And in fact, what we need to do is have more teams that emerge to solve specific problems. So I call this swarming. Swarming, the key here is most teams go through the standard norming, storming, forming ideas. Swarms are different because they will emerge from your organization if you give them an interesting enough idea. And it causes something that Amy Edmondson calls fast trust. So it reduces the amount of time it takes them to get together as a team because they're so interested in the project, they're less interested in the politics. The other thing is swarms are temporary, so they know that they don't have to work with that team forever. People who are highly connected provide highly redundant information. So in most organizations, you see things like this. So if you're doing Scrum, you might have a Scrum of Scrums. If you're doing anything else, you might have a committee that meets to do like your architecture committee or something like that. So again, what happens is these people are all taken out of the context of their work, which is the teams that they work with, and they discuss things in a completely separate context that is very abstract and produces bad results. So they just end up talking about the same things over and over again. Often in organizations that start Scrum of Scrums, you'll see a profound effect for about 2 months, and then people will get really tired of going to the Scrum of Scrum meeting. Instead, take your linear view, your value stream view, and take one member of the downstream team and have them go upstream. If you have a daily stand-up on the upstream, so they can go and they just listen to what's happening at for that other team. So literally, they'll know, you go to stand-up, generally who's doing what. And the result of this is like, if this is your dev team and this is your support team, these guys are working on some funky login form or something like that. This guy's listening, and he knows that it's about to be released. People start getting phone calls in the support department about not being able to log in. This guy can go immediately upstream and knows generally who's working on that work. They know him, and they can very quickly begin negotiating how to solve that problem. The teams that don't have this closure, that don't have the ability to do that, often just point fingers at each other because they don't want to take blame. Again, that explicit negotiation happening. So instead of seeing people as the sources of information, clusters are the source and people are the ports. So start thinking about your teams as having internet connections, and you want to make sure they're all plugged together. And the plug is a broker who's making sure the information is moving across the teams well. Finally, I think finally, and then I have the Conways Law to go with. So finally, capacity planning. And do any guys do networking? So like capacity planning and networking, right? Like you never fill your pipe up. There's some peak time in your pipe, and then there's the normal time in your pipe, right? And you don't plan for the normal time, you plan for the peak time. Which means that in general, you assume that there's some overhead. There's some free space in that network. You need to think of your teams in the same way, right? So do not fully utilize your teams in the same way you would not fully utilize your network connections, right? And so that has some interesting problems. So in order to get that resilience, in order to be able to handle those spikes in needs, you need to figure out what to do with people. I like to ask people to read books at work. To be seen doing reading or learning at work. It's an example of what I would call non-critical work, right? So you want to reserve a certain amount of capacity, and you want the people who are in that capacity to be able to do work that is not on the critical path. And the result of that is that risk in knowledge work often works two ways, right? There's the risk of something going bad, and then there's the risk of something good happening. And if you have fully utilized capacity, you can't react to either of those. So make sure you do capacity planning across your network. All right. How many of you know what Conway's Law is? Okay, I got 1 guy, 2 guys, 3 guys, 4 guys. Okay, so this is Conway's, no, this is John Steely Brown, and he basically says what I've been saying, right? Which is changing the way that you participate in your network changes your organization. And really, in knowledge work, the way that we participate largely drives our capabilities and our ability to work effectively. And in ways I think that are profound and often misunderstood. So the result of this is that often what we do when we're trying to improve work is we look at the work, we look at the thing that we created, and we inspect and adapt. And the problem with that is that it's an assumption that humans are rational. Humans aren't very rational. And so we really need to start designing systems with this idea that humans are bounded by their perception, understanding, and rationality. So this is Conway's Law, which basically says your software will be a reflection of the way you organize your business. So my parting invitation to you is take the list of words that you wrote down at the beginning of this talk, go back to your organizations and try to figure out, does the organization itself have the qualities I want my software to have? Because if it does not, you should not expect the software itself to have those qualities. And these are my inspirations, and that's me. Thank you very much.
On a un petit peu de temps pour poser quelques...
There's a bit of time left, so there is time for questions.
What the tools can bring to the social dynamics, social capital, like enterprise social network?
So what types of tools can you use to do this?
Yeah.
So I think the most critical tool is the value stream mapping that I showed, is probably one of the more important ones, so you actually understand your social network. I think social capital in general, you asked the enterprise question, so I will answer it as directly as I can. Social capital is generally, I think, limited, at least in the ways that I've described it, by Dunbar's number. So pods of about 150 people can establish this level of trust and be effective in this way. Bigger groups than that won't be able to leverage as many of these ideas, but that might be one of the ways that you need to think about the organization, is how to make them capable, so how to podularize the organization, if that makes sense.
So thanks for the talk. I'd like to talk. I'm wondering, when you say that after human capital comes social capital, I mean, the example you gave with the lawyer that changed companies, in the end it boils down to that person managed to navigate the network and made the difference. So essentially it is still the human capital that plays this tune, that plays this machine. So is it really a succession that social capital comes after human capital? It seems to me that it's still the human capital that sort of makes all this work.
Yeah, so I would say, in general, I would say, if you could say that about all of the progressions that I said. So people still own buildings, people still own machines, people still own information systems, right? So those are all things that still are true. I just think that social capital is the most recent way of trying to think about what we're trying to manage. So I don't necessarily think it's better, but I think it's the current challenge that we're faced with because we're doing so much knowledge work, right? In other words, having a group of talented people is probably a good idea, right? I'm not saying you should just apply this to dumb groups of people and get the same success. So Edwards Deming, famous lean thinker, would say something to the extent of, most performance problems, most problems in a company, 96% of those problems are the system and not the individuals in the system. So people's behavior is driven by the networks that they're in. And that's largely what I'm saying. pay attention, instead of trying to do individual development, pay attention to the system and make sure the system is more effective.